Welcome to War Bios, the podcast that delves into the most pivotal conflicts in history, where strategy meets sacrifice and leadership is forged in the fire of battle. I'm your host, General Biography, and today we're going to explore one of the most decisive engagements of the American Civil War, the Battle of Second Bull Run, fought in August 1862. This clash of arms would prove a crucible for both the Union and Confederate armies, testing their mettle, tactics, and resolve. The Confederacy, despite being outmanned and outgunned, had managed to hold its own against the Union Army, thanks in large part to the brilliant tactics of General Robert E. Lee. Meanwhile, the Union Army of Virginia, led by General John Pope, was tasked with defending the nation's capital and disrupting Confederate supply lines. Our story begins in the rolling hills and verdant countryside of Northern Virginia, where the tranquil landscape belied the turmoil that was to come. In July 1862, General Pope's army was stationed near the Rappahannock River, poised to strike at the Confederate capital of Richmond. However, Lee had other plans. He dispatched General Stonewall Jackson's corps to confront Pope's army with the aim of driving them back and protecting the vital railroad junction at Manassas. As we examine the origins of the Battle of Second Bull Run, it's essential to understand the complex web of events that led to this fateful encounter. In the spring of 1862, the Union Army of the Potomac, under General George McClellan, had launched a massive campaign to capture Richmond, only to be repelled by Lee's clever defenses. The Confederate victory at the 7 Days Battles, which took place from June 25 to July 1, 1862, had given Lee the initiative, and he was determined to exploit this momentum. The 7 Days Battles were a series of engagements fought near Richmond, as McClellan's army attempted to take the city. However, Lee's forces, although outnumbered, managed to repel the Union advances at battles such as Oak Grove, Beaver Dam Creek, and Gaines's Mill. The final battle of the 7 days, Malvern Hill, saw the Confederates suffer heavy casualties, but they had successfully defended Richmond, and McClellan's army was forced to retreat. With the Union Army of the Potomac in disarray, Lee turned his attention to the north, where General Pope's Army of Virginia was gathering strength. Pope, a seasoned commander with experience in the Western theater, had been tasked with defending Washington, D.C. and disrupting Confederate supply lines. However, he faced significant challenges, including a lack of familiarity with the terrain and a shortage of troops. As Pope's army began to take shape, Lee saw an opportunity to strike at the Union forces before they could become too entrenched. He dispatched Jackson's corps, which consisted of approximately 24,000 soldiers, to confront Pope's army near Manassas. The battle would be fought over 2 days, August 29–30, 1862, and would prove to be one of the bloodiest engagements of the Civil War. The Union Army of Virginia, comprising approximately 62,000 soldiers, was arrayed across the rolling hills and verdant countryside of Northern Virginia, with its right flank anchored on the Rappahannock River. Meanwhile, Jackson's corps, consisting of around 24,000 seasoned troops, had been dispatched by General Robert E. Lee to confront Pope's army near Manassas. The battle commenced on August 29, as Jackson's forces launched a surprise attack on the Union positions near Groveton, a small hamlet situated near the old Manassas battlefield. The Confederate assault was spearheaded by the storied Stonewall Brigade, which had earned its reputation for tenacity and bravery during the Shenandoah Valley campaign earlier that year. As the Confederates pushed forward, they encountered fierce resistance from the Union troops, who were determined to hold their ground. One of the most significant engagements on the first day of the battle took place at the Bronner Farm, where the Union Brigade of Colonel John Gibbon clashed with the Confederate Brigade of Colonel Isaac Trimble. The fighting was intense and chaotic, with both sides suffering heavy casualties as they exchanged volleys of artillery fire and musketry. As the sun rose on August 30, the Union Army launched a series of attacks against the Confederate positions, hoping to dislodge Jackson's forces from their defensive lines. However, the Confederates were well entrenched and prepared to repel the Union advances. The fighting was fierce and relentless, with both sides suffering heavy losses as they clashed in a maelstrom of steel and fire. One of the most pivotal moments of the battle occurred when the Union Corps of General John Porter launched a massive assault against the Confederate positions on the Henry House Hill. The Union troops advanced bravely, but were ultimately repelled by the Confederates, who had carefully prepared their defensive lines to channel the Union attack into killing zones. As the Union forces retreated in disarray, the Confederates counterattacked, driving them back across the battlefield. The Battle of Second Bull Run was a crushing defeat for the Union Army, with casualties totaling over 16,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. The Confederate victory, on the other hand, had come at a cost of around 9,500 casualties. As the dust settled on the battlefield, it became clear that the Confederacy had gained a significant strategic advantage, having successfully defended its capital and disrupted the Union Army's plans to march on Richmond. The battle also marked a turning point in the war, as General Robert E. Lee began to shift his focus from defensive operations to a more aggressive strategy aimed at taking the fight to the Union Army on its own territory. As the dust settled on the battlefield at Second Bull Run, General Robert E. Lee began to shift his focus from defensive operations to a more aggressive strategy aimed at taking the fight to the Union Army on its own territory. Lee's ultimate goal was to win a decisive victory on Northern soil, which he believed would persuade the United States government to recognize the Confederacy as a sovereign nation. To achieve this objective, Lee launched the Maryland Campaign, a bold invasion of the North that would ultimately lead to the Battle of Antietam. The Maryland Campaign began in early September 1862, when Lee's Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac River into Maryland. The Confederate Army was a formidable force, comprising over 50,000 seasoned troops who had been battle-hardened by their victories at Bull Run and other engagements. As they marched through Maryland, the Confederates were met with a mixture of enthusiasm and hostility from the local population. While some Marylanders sympathized with the Southern cause, others remained loyal to the Union and opposed the Confederate invasion. One of the key challenges facing Lee during the Maryland Campaign was the need to maintain a secure line of communication and supply. To achieve this, he dispatched a portion of his army under General Thomas Stonewall Jackson to capture the strategic town of Harper's Ferry, which controlled access to the Shenandoah Valley. The Union garrison at Harper's Ferry, commanded by Colonel Dixon Miles, was heavily outnumbered and outgunned, and after a brief siege, they surrendered on September 15, 1862. Meanwhile, the main body of Lee's army continued its march through Maryland, with the ultimate goal of reaching the town of Hagerstown, where they could threaten the Union capital at Washington, D.C. However, their progress was slowed by the need to wait for Jackson's troops to complete their mission at Harper's Ferry. This delay gave the Union Army, now commanded by General George McClellan, a crucial opportunity to regroup and prepare to confront the Confederates. The Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862, would be a pivotal engagement that would determine the course of the war and have far-reaching consequences for both the Union and the Confederacy. These events marked a crucial turning point in the war, as the Confederacy began to transition from a defensive strategy to a more aggressive posture. In conclusion, the aftermath of the Battle of Second Bull Run marked a significant shift in the war, as General Robert E. Lee launched the Maryland Campaign and began to take the fight to the Union Army on its own territory. The events that unfolded during this campaign would ultimately lead to the bloodiest single-day battle in American history, Antietam. That's all for today's War Bios. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, I'm General Biography reminding you to keep marching toward victory.